As she passed by the janitor, the millionaire woman was paralyzed upon seeing his medal, the same one her son wore when he disappeared many years ago. In the imposing Whitman mansion, Elizabeth never gave up searching for her son, who disappeared 20 years ago. David, a mysterious young man, appears with a silver medal that may hold the key to solving this mystery. The past and present collide. Secrets will be revealed. Get ready for the unexpected and do not miss the end of this thrilling story. In the heart of New York, in the vast and luxurious Whitman mansion, the days followed an unrelenting pace. Elizabeth Whitman, a successful businesswoman, frequently traveled for work, leaving the mansion under the care of a strict butler named Thomas. The opulent home, with its crystal chandeliers and endless corridors, contrasted with Elizabeth's lonely routine. The nights in the mansion were especially solitary, with silence only broken by the ticking of the large clocks and the soft rustle of the curtains in the wind. Despite all her wealth, a persistent emptiness had accompanied her since the mysterious disappearance of her son, Nathaniel, over 20 years ago. David, the newly hired janitor, did not go unnoticed. His deep blue eyes and the calm he emanated intrigued everyone. David had a past shrouded in mystery. He was found as a baby, abandoned in an alley, with only one clue about his origins: a miraculous silver medal he always wore, engraved with the name Elizabeth. Adopted by a humble family, David grew up with the silent hope of one day uncovering his past. David faced daily challenges under the critical eye of Thomas, the strict butler. Nothing he did seemed to please the butler, who always found flaws in his work. Nevertheless, David remained dedicated, determined to do his best and find his place in this new environment. During his breaks, David often looked at the old portraits of the Whitman family, imagining what his life would be like if he were part of that family. On that particular morning, the mansion was in chaos. Elizabeth was due to return from a long business trip, and Thomas was more demanding than ever. David worked tirelessly, cleaning every corner with precision and care despite Thomas's constant criticisms. "David, didn't you notice that you left a stain here?" Thomas pointed to the floor disdainfully. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll clean it immediately," David replied calmly, picking up his cloth and returning to work. "You need to be more attentive," Thomas grumbled, turning to leave. Despite the criticisms, David held on to hope. The medal around his neck was his talisman, a constant reminder that he was destined for something greater. He believed that one day it would lead him to answers about his past. In moments of silence, when the work was done and the mansion was shrouded in twilight, David held the medal and whispered to himself, trying to imagine who the Elizabeth engraved on it was. David's introduction to the Whitman mansion brought a new dynamic to the environment. Although Thomas maintained his severe behavior, the other employees began to sympathize with the young janitor. David's presence, with his aura of mystery and dedicated work, started to leave a mark on the mansion's rigid routine. He spent nights reflecting on his past, his present, and an uncertain but hopeful future. With Elizabeth Whitman's return to the mansion, the atmosphere became even more tense. All the employees knew that the mistress had high standards and that any slip would be unforgivable. Elizabeth was an imposing woman, with a presence that dominated any room. When she walked through the front door, bringing with her an air of sophistication and authority, everyone hurried to make their greetings, including David, who watched her from a distance. That afternoon, while Elizabeth inspected the house, her eyes fell on David, who was polishing one of the marble statuettes in the living room. Something about him caught her attention. Perhaps it was the focused and careful way he worked, or maybe it was the silver medal that shone in the sunlight hanging around his neck. Elizabeth approached slowly, her curiosity piqued. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. David quickly lifted his head, surprised to see the mistress up close. He straightened up, trying to hide his nervousness. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitman," he replied, trying to stay calm. "That medal, Elizabeth began, her eyes fixed on David's necklace. "Where did you get it?" David hesitated for a moment before answering. He knew this was a question that could change his life. "I've had it since I was found, ma'am," he explained. "I was adopted by a family when I was a baby, and this medal was with me. It's the only clue about my past." Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. The medal was identical to the one her son Nathaniel wore when he disappeared. A whirlwind of emotions invaded her. Hope, fear, and a spark of possibility. "May I see it?" she asked, extending her hand. David carefully removed the medal and handed it to Elizabeth. She held it delicately, turning it over to see the back. And there it was, engraved in small but clear letters, "Elizabeth." A wave of emotions crossed Elizabeth's face. She handed the medal back to David with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "Please, continue with your work." David put the medal back around his neck, feeling more confused than ever. He knew something important had just happened, but he wasn't sure what. Meanwhile, in the mansion, Thomas watched the interaction between Elizabeth and David from a distance. He didn't like the young janitor and felt that something was about to change, making him even more irritated and distrustful. During an internal renovation of the house, a storm formed outside, reflecting the growing tension inside the mansion. David's work was once again the target of Thomas's criticism, who seemed more severe and cruel than usual. "This is unacceptable," Thomas shouted, pointing to a small imperfection in the cleaning. "How do you expect to work here if you can't even do the basics?" David, already frustrated and on the verge of despair, tried to defend himself. "I'm doing my best, sir. This house is huge, and there is a lot of work to be done." Shut up," Thomas interrupted. "I don't want excuses. I want results." Before the argument could escalate further, Elizabeth entered the room, her expression serious. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice firm. Thomas turned, surprised and somewhat frightened. "Mrs. Whitman, I was just—" he began but was interrupted. "I've heard enough," she said, looking from Thomas to David. "Thomas, we need to talk about your behavior towards the employees. And David, you're doing a great job. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Elizabeth left the room, leaving Thomas furious and David relieved but also worried about what would come next. The young janitor felt that Elizabeth's presence would bring significant changes, but he couldn't yet predict the full impact it would have on his life. Elizabeth's intervention in defense of David marked the beginning of a change in the mansion's dynamics. The other employees, seeing the mistress's stance, began to treat David with more respect, although Thomas continued to make his life difficult. Nevertheless, the young janitor felt a renewed hope growing inside him. He knew that Elizabeth was interested in his medal and the mystery surrounding it. One night, after a long day of work, David was tidying up the final details in the library when Elizabeth entered, carrying a box of old documents. She looked at David and, with a gentle smile, invited him to sit down. "David, I'd like to talk to you," she said, pointing to a chair. David, a bit nervous, sat down and waited while Elizabeth placed the box on the table. "This medal," she began, pointing to David's necklace, "belonged to my son, Nathaniel. He disappeared 20 years ago when he was only 5 years old. I never lost hope of finding him." David was surprised by the revelation. He had always felt the medal was special, but had never imagined it could be linked to such a tragic and personal story. "My God," he murmured, touching the medal around his neck. "I didn't know." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "I need to know more about how you were found," she said softly. "Can you tell me everything you know?" David nodded and began to tell his story. He talked about how he was found in an alley, wrapped in a blanket with the medal around his neck. He told about his adoption by a humble and loving family and how he always wondered about his origins. "This medal is the only clue I have," he said. "I always believed it would one day lead me to discover more about who I really am." Elizabeth listened to every word attentively, feeling a growing connection with David. There was something about him that made her believe he could be her lost son. She decided that she needed to investigate further. "David, I'll need your help," she said, determined. "I'll call a police friend to help us investigate your past. We'll find out the truth together." David agreed, feeling both anxious and hopeful. In the following days, Elizabeth and her police friend, Detective Johnson, began to revisit David's past. They spoke with the adoptive family, reviewed old records, and followed every available lead. "Detective Johnson, we need to find any records of missing children from that time," said Elizabeth, determined. "Of course, Elizabeth," replied the detective. "We'll go through all the files and see what we can find. If David really is your son, we'll need concrete proof." The days turned into weeks, and the investigation progressed slowly. Each new discovery brought new hope. One day, Detective Johnson brought crucial information. "We found a hospital report of a child who was found abandoned at the same time and place where David was found," he said, showing the documents. "And here's the interesting part. The description of the medal matches exactly the one David has." Elizabeth felt her heart race. She was closer to the truth than ever before. "That's incredible," she exclaimed. "We need to confirm his identity." Detective Johnson suggested conducting a DNA test to be sure. Elizabeth agreed and quickly arranged everything necessary. When the DNA test results arrived, Elizabeth could hardly contain her anxiety. She opened the envelope with trembling hands, and her heart raced as she read the words confirming her suspicion. David was indeed her lost son, Nathaniel. Elizabeth fell into tears of relief and joy, embracing David tightly. David, initially shocked, felt a wave of emotions envelop him. Finally, he knew who he was and where he came from. "My son," Elizabeth whispered, holding David's face. "You've come back to me." David embraced his mother, feeling a sense of belonging and love he had never experienced before. The void in his heart was finally beginning to fill. The discovery that David was indeed Nathaniel, Elizabeth's lost son, transformed the dynamics of the Whitman mansion. The mystery finally solved brought new light to the lives of everyone involved, but also new challenges and intense emotions. The next morning after the revelation, Elizabeth organized a meeting with all the house staff to announce the news. The main hall was filled with curious and anxious looks. Elizabeth stood beside David, who now wore the silver medal with a new sense of pride and belonging. "I have something very important to share with all of you," Elizabeth began, her voice firm but emotional. "This young man here by my side, David, is my son Nathaniel, who disappeared 20 years ago." Shock and surprise spread through the hall. Thomas, the butler, was incredulous, his expression frozen in a mix of disbelief and apprehension. Elizabeth continued, her gaze fixed on the faces around her. "Nathaniel has returned to us, and this means many things will change from now on," she said, with a smile that conveyed both relief and joy. "I hope you all can give him the support and respect he deserves." David, feeling the gravity of the moment, stepped forward. "I want to thank you all for welcoming me here," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "And especially, I want to thank my mother for never giving up on looking for me. I am eager to start this new phase of my life with all of you." Elizabeth squeezed David's hand, a simple gesture that spoke more than 1,000 words. The meeting ended with applause and smiles, although some doubts and uncertainties still lingered in the air. "I can't believe this," murmured Thomas, as he walked away from the group. "How is this possible?" "It seems the truth always finds a way to come out," replied one of the maids, with a smile of relief. In the following days, Elizabeth and David began to get to know each other better. They spent hours talking, sharing stories and memories. David talked about his life with his adoptive family, the challenges he faced, and his hopes for the future. Elizabeth, in turn, spoke about the pain of loss and the joy of finding her son again. The relationship between mother and son flourished, but not everyone was happy with the new dynamic. Thomas, especially, seemed more distant and resentful. Elizabeth noticed his change in behavior and decided to confront him. "Thomas, I need to talk to you," said Elizabeth, finding the butler in the library. "Yes, Mrs. Whitman?" replied Thomas, trying to hide his apprehension. "I've noticed you're different since we discovered Nathaniel," said Elizabeth, direct. "I want you to know that he is my son, and nothing will change that. But I also value your work and loyalty. Is there something you want to tell me?" Thomas hesitated, but finally gave in to the pressure of years of resentment. "Mrs. Whitman, I've always served this house with devotion, but this situation, it's hard to accept," he confessed. "Nathaniel, he is a good boy, but I fear what this means for the future." Elizabeth sighed, understanding the complexity of Thomas's feelings. "Thomas, I understand your concerns, but I want you to know that Nathaniel is not here to take anything from anyone. He is part of this family, just like you," she said firmly. "I hope we can find a way to work together and overcome this." Thomas, with a more relieved expression, nodded. "I'll do my best, Mrs. Whitman," he promised. Meanwhile, David also faced his own challenges. Being recognized as the heir to the Whitman fortune brought with it expectations and responsibilities. He began to study and prepare to take on a role in the family business. Elizabeth guided him with patience and wisdom, and gradually, David showed his potential and dedication. But life had more surprises in store. During a visit to an orphanage where Elizabeth regularly made donations, David found an old photograph that intrigued him. In the image, he recognized a man he had seen in one of Elizabeth's old photos. Elizabeth looked at the photo, her face paling. The man in the photo was her former partner and trusted friend, Jonathan Harper, who had disappeared shortly after Nathaniel. "Jonathan," murmured Elizabeth. "He disappeared almost at the same time as you. I always thought there was something strange about his disappearance." David and Elizabeth decided to investigate more about Jonathan, feeling there was a crucial connection between the disappearances. With the help of Detective Johnson, they discovered that Jonathan had been involved in a fraudulent scheme and that his disappearance was linked to Nathaniel's kidnapping. The revelation was shocking but also brought a sense of justice and relief. They had unraveled a mystery that had hung over the family for years. With the truth finally revealed, Elizabeth and David could now move forward, more united and determined than ever. With the discovery of the connection between Jonathan Harper and Nathaniel's kidnapping, life at the Whitman mansion seemed to finally begin to stabilize. Elizabeth and David, now closer than ever, began to rebuild the lost years, and the mansion filled with a new air of hope and renewal. Elizabeth decided it was time to clarify all the details of Jonathan Harper's story. She knew this would bring peace to both of them and allow the family to move forward. With Detective Johnson, Elizabeth and David revisited old files and spoke with Jonathan's old acquaintances. "Detective Johnson, we need to fully understand what happened with Jonathan," said Elizabeth, determined. "Of course, Elizabeth," replied the detective. "We'll go through all the records and see what we can find. If he was really involved in the kidnapping, we need all the possible evidence." The investigation revealed that Jonathan Harper had gotten involved in a money laundering scheme that put him at odds with dangerous criminals. He had kidnapped Nathaniel as a means of blackmail to ensure his own safety. But something went wrong, and Jonathan ended up disappearing. Meanwhile, the relationship between Elizabeth and David grew stronger every day. Elizabeth was determined to ensure her son had a bright future, and David was eager to live up to the family legacy. They began to plan the future together, discussing David's plans to work in the family business and how he could contribute to its continued success. "Mom, I want to learn everything about the company," said David with determination. I want to help expand it and make our name even more respected. I'm sure you'll do a great job, my dear, replied Elizabeth with a proud smile. We'll work together and ensure our family's future is bright. However, not everyone was satisfied with the changes at the Whitman mansion. Thomas, the butler, still felt threatened by David's presence and the impact he was having on the house's dynamics. His feelings of resentment and envy grew each day, culminating in a desperate action. One night, while Elizabeth and David were in the library, Thomas burst into the room with an envelope in his hands. His expression was one of anger and desperation. "Mrs. Whitman, this can't go on like this," he exclaimed, trembling. "I know what really happened with Jonathan Harper, and you need to know it too." Elizabeth and David looked at each other, surprised by Thomas's sudden outburst. "What do you mean, Thomas?" asked Elizabeth, cautious. Thomas handed the envelope to Elizabeth, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter written by Jonathan Harper before he disappeared, explaining his involvement in Nathaniel's kidnapping and revealing a devastating secret. Jonathan was actually David's biological father. Elizabeth felt her world collapse. The revelation brought up a series of questions and conflicting emotions. David, upon learning the truth, was in shock, unsure how to process the information. "This can't be true," murmured Elizabeth, tears in her eyes. "How did I never know this?" "I didn't know either," replied Thomas, now calmer. "But upon discovering it, I realized this would change everything. I thought you had the right to know." David, shaken, stepped back, trying to absorb the impact of the revelation. Elizabeth ran to him, hugging him tightly. "No matter what the letter says, you are my son," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "We are a family, and nothing will change that." David returned the hug, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. He knew his life would never be the same, but he also knew that his mother's love and the bond they had built were unbreakable. The revelation of David's true biological father brought a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments for everyone at the Whitman mansion. At first, the shock was overwhelming, but with time, the truth was accepted, and the family began to heal the wounds of the past. Elizabeth and David, now more united than ever, decided that the best way forward was to embrace the truth and move on with love and honesty. Jonathan Harper's letter, although devastating, also brought a sense of closure. Jonathan had confessed his mistakes and, in a way, sought redemption by explaining the truth about Nathaniel's kidnapping. In the days that followed, Elizabeth and David worked together to integrate David into the family business. Elizabeth, with her vast knowledge and experience, taught David everything about the business, while he showed impressive dedication and intelligence. "Mom, I want to thank you for accepting me and teaching me so much," said David, as they worked together in the office. "You are my son, David," replied Elizabeth with a loving smile. "I will always be grateful that we found each other again, and I know you will do amazing things for our company and our family." With time, David earned the respect of everyone in the company, showing himself to be a fair and visionary leader. He faced challenges and even some internal sabotage, but his determination and skills won everyone over. The company thrived under his leadership, and Elizabeth felt prouder each day. Meanwhile, Thomas, the butler, quietly stepped away from the Whitman mansion. He realized his role in the house had changed and decided it was time to move on. Before leaving, he said goodbye to Elizabeth and David. "Mrs. Whitman, David," said Thomas with a slight smile, "it has been an honor to serve this house for so many years. I wish you all the best in the future." "Thank you, Thomas," replied Elizabeth sincerely. "I hope you find peace and happiness wherever you go." David extended his hand to Thomas. "Thank you for everything, Thomas," he said, shaking the butler's hand. Thomas nodded and, with one last look at the mansion, left to start a new chapter in his life. As time passed, the Whitman mansion became a symbol of resilience and renewal. Elizabeth and David organized a celebration to mark the family's new beginning. The mansion was filled with friends, family, and colleagues, all gathered to celebrate the Whitman family's unity and success. During the celebration, Elizabeth gave an emotional speech. "Today, we celebrate not only the success of our company but also the strength of our family," she began, her voice firm and emotional. "We have faced many challenges, but we overcame each one with love and determination. And now, looking at all of you, I feel immense gratitude and hope for the future." David, standing next to his mother, felt deep pride and a peace he had long sought. He knew that, regardless of what the future held, he had a loving family and a legacy to honor. The party continued with laughter, music, and joy. Elizabeth and David, finally at peace with the past, looked to the future with optimism and confidence. They knew that, together, they could face any challenge and that love and truth would always prevail.